Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon, and today I'm joined by Jack as we go over the top 10 decks in the standard format. We have both just returned from the Bremen Regional Championships, which was the first major regional which has had the post-rotation format, and we feel that now we've had some results to have a look at. We've seen what's been popular, what's being played, what's being successful most importantly, and we feel now we are in a good spot to give you the top 10 list for the next few tournaments in the Breakthrough to Burning Shadows format. So let's kick off in number 10.
Yeah, so starting us off, we've got Rainbow Force, a deck that I think some people kind of have just forgotten about. But it turns out it's still an alright play. There was one, I think there was only the one in top 32 this weekend, but one did make top 32. His list was, obviously we don't have Skyfield anymore, so it's much more reliant on the dual types. But it happens that one or two of the dual types actually mean that we have really, really good matchups against some of the top tier decks anyway, even without looking at Rainbow Force Xerneas itself. Bisharp being able to take down Gardevoir and Ninetales. It's kind of convoluted, but you can still do huge chunks to them pretty easily. And then Galvantula being able to clean up things like Greninja means that as long as Xerneas can hold out for the other matchups, you actually have a fairly decent sort of coverage across multiple matchups. It's not like we're going to talk about another Xerneas variant later on, so but it's not the most consistent variant. I feel it's never had that super consistent feel to it. In my opinion, it feels a bit like a Ray style deck where if you draw well enough, you can beat anything. But if you don't quite draw well enough, then you have a pretty inconsistent deck. But that being said, with things like Bisharp and Galvantula and the inherent strength of Rainbow Force, plus it now having Choice Band as well, the deck really hasn't seen too much play even since Choice Band's been released around 6 months ago. So now factoring in the fact that we have Choice Band as well, the Rainbow Force attack can actually be doing huge amounts of damage relatively quickly. So as you can see, we've put on the favourable matchups, Gardevoir and Ninetales. As I said, Bisharp can do a chunk to both of these. So that's really, really good. Unfavourables, Metagross is pretty unfavourable. They have 250 HP to start off with, which is a huge amount. I'm pretty sure. I think you need. I can't work out exactly how many types on the fly you need, but you need a huge board setup to be able to consistently one-shot Metagrosses. And when they can even set up 2 Metagrosses and start hitting you with Metangs to be able to actually flip the prize trade back in their favor. So it's super difficult, I feel. And Gliscod Garb is another one that I think is pretty difficult. Gliscod's being able to hit you for 120 consistently as of turn 2 means that you kind of struggle to be able to keep up with them, even though you're racing them in that they're taking 1 prize on you taking 2. They're able to actually get set up so much more consistently than you. And in the late game, Garb only needs 6 items to start swinging as well, if you're playing Choice Bands over Fury Belts. So it's definitely, I think, a pretty difficult matchup. And as we'll go through our top 10, you'll see that Gliscod Garb is pretty high up there. So it's going to be a matchup that you're expecting to see at least 2 or 3 rounds of the day, I would expect. Tech options-wise, Field Blower and Potown are essentially the ones we've gone for to try and help with some of these evolution decks, and to try and get rid of things like tools on things like Garb, things like Fury Belts that are slowly creeping back into the format, all of this kind of stuff that you don't want to have to deal with. It can mean that Rainbow Force can still compete in today's format. I think it's definitely deserving of its number 10 spot because I don't think it's quite at the power level of some of these other decks, but it made top 32, so it's definitely one to be considered. And if you feel you can run hot with the deck, it definitely can still do stupidly good things just because Rainbow Force is a super efficient attack and can do huge numbers.
Yeah, it's kind of glass cannon-like in that it doesn't always set up how you want it to. When it does, it hits ridiculous numbers. It's just only this high. It's only number 10 because of its inherent inconsistencies. Because you need to have the board full of lots of different types, you only play like 1 or 2 Tapu Leles. And when we no longer have Versus Seeker, N is so much more painful against you, even if you have Oranguru to back you up. And if people actually Grinch down some of the dual types, your damage output can be limited even. So there's a lot of weaknesses here for Xerneas. But when it does get the optimal setup, and when you come up against things like Gardevoir, I think Gardevoir's like pretty free if you play a 2/2 Bishop, no matter what you do really, as long as you play choice bands, and like if you have Town and stuff, it should be pretty free. So that's the main appeal of Rainbow Force, but it still is littered with inconsistencies in my book. In at number 9 we have Decidueye. It's sort of moved away from Forest, of course, because it's rotated, so it's way lower down than it used to be. Now it relies on a rare candy engine. Still has Alolan Vulpix in the back to use Beacon and get you into your Pokemon, so it does have, a similar engine to things like Metagross, and we're, accustomed to seeing 3 or 4 Metagross on the board, so we know that it's possible, even though we no longer have the broken stadium anymore. And Feather Arrow is still a really good ability, being able to access the entire board and making sure every damage counter counts is very, very good. Having Ninetales Jets can improve your type coverage, and if you have things like Tapu Koko as well, you can attack both Volks and the Ho-Oh GXs, so your real only bad matchup are Garbodor variants. It's not great to be bad against Garbodor builds because they are powerful, but only having those to be concerned about is not bad for you. So I think if I was playing Decidueye, I'd be playing like 3 Field Blowers, even though you have Hollow Hunt to get them back. I think it's just so ridiculously important right now to not just auto lose that matchup. Because against a lot of other decks, you're actually feeling pretty good, because you're going to have the Devolve package in here, you're going to play the Espeon EX, you're going to ping things down, you're going to use your Ice Blades to target the appropriate Pokemon, you're going to use Tapu Koko to flip all over the board. You could even play Necrozma GX if you still want to. It was something that I was doing for Worlds when I was testing Decidueye, and I loved the attack from Necrozma GX. Very powerful, even against heavy non-evolving decks, because you can deal with Tapu Leles. And again, I go back to Versus Seeker rotating, so people are increasing their Lele counts and increasing their reliance on Lele, so Necrozma naturally gets more value. So it's got a bunch of favourables just because it can devolve stuff. Its typing is still amazing for Greninja, and it just has ridiculous HP. So I think figuring out the Garbodor is the big challenge for Decidueye, and that's why it's not higher up on the list. And the fact that we have to go via Candy, which is inherently much more difficult than going via Forest. So less powerful than it's been in the past, but still a contender in my book.
Yeah, definitely. I played against one of these this weekend. I was playing Gardevoir, and it definitely is a favourable matchup. The fact that we have we still have the Devolution Espeon in the format means that you only need 2 or 3 turns of Decidueye plus Koko, and there is a win condition automatically on the board. All your opponent has to do is then find Espeon and an energy. It makes it actually really, really scary to play against, because it puts you on such a clock. So it's definitely not a deck to sleep on. Like we've said, it's one that was much higher up, of course, because Forest inherently made Decidueye kind of broken. Now it's back to a rare candy engine. It's definitely slower, and there will be games where you don't get the setup before your opponent has pressured you down 6 prizes. But that being said, against some of these Stage 2 decks, you don't have the time to be, you have enough time to be able to set up multiple Decidueyes, have a couple of turns of Koko, and then like I say, your win condition is present on the board. You just have to draw into it. And with things like Koko in there, plus having 240 HP on Decidueyes, you have turns where you can tank and just carry on drawing cards, and as soon as you draw Espeon plus energy, you've got the win. So it's actually in a really interesting spot. It's one that I personally had pretty much written off as soon as Forest rotated, but it's really interesting to see that it's still sort of in and around the format, even if it is down at number 9. Tech-wise, we've gone with Max Potion and Drampa. Max Potion is super good for, again, just tanking and getting extra turns of Feather Arrow. That's all the deck wants. The deck wants time. Every turn you give this deck, it's 1 turn closer to winning. And being able to Max Potion off huge amounts of damage when you've got 240 HP is just insane. And then Drampa is another one that's actually really nice to help start dealing with these Garbodor variants. Gliscod Garb exclusively plays at least 8 special energy, so you can actually really, really screw them over. They do run 3 Guzma to be able to get around your Drampas and try and take prizes on other stuff. But you can eventually run them out of energy, and if they have to start digging for their grass energy rather than their rainbows, It can make their setup a whole lot slower if they don't feel safe attaching these special energy anyway. And then pretty much all Garb variants anyway are running DCEs. Espeon still needs DCE to be able to put on pressure to divide turn 2, and that's kind of what it wants to do against you. It wants to ping off a Rowlet as soon as possible just to try and start giving them an extra turn to start building up a board. So they're going to be playing their DCs just to try and keep tempo with you. So being able to Drampa them back is actually really, really nice, as well as hit them for a chunk as well. So yeah, it's definitely much lower down the tier list now because it doesn't have Forest, so it inherently doesn't have that kind of power. But that being said, a teched out version definitely can, I think, still see success in today's format. So next up we have, what is it?
It's definitely,
it's Greninja. It's again a deck that I kind of wrote off as soon as it lost Dive Ball, Level Ball, Repeat Ball, and Rough Seas. I was like, this deck is dead. But Greninja finds a way of surviving every single format that it seems unfavorable in. People still play Greninja, and people still do well with it. I don't think any. Well, none made top 8 this weekend. I don't know whether any made top 32. I don't think any did.
No.
But it was actually still represented much. Or there was still a much higher representation than I thought there would be this weekend. I saw at least 4 or 5 in the early rounds. So people are still repping this deck, which is one of the most interesting things. Like I say, people clearly don't think that it was completely reliant on Dive Ball and that kind of thing. And you have really good favorable matchups. Gardevoir is, provided you can get a fairly decent board setup, Gardevoir is actually a really fine matchup. They need 5 energy, and if you can start Shadow Stitching from turn 3, it's really, really difficult for them to actually ramp into having 5 energy to KO your breaks. And especially if you can get the Starmie set up as well, when you can double Shuriken plus ability lock them, it's actually gross how favorable that is for Greninja. Obviously, Volcanion is pretty free, being able to item lock plus with weakness is super strong, and very similar sort of situation with Metagross to Gardy. They're a super slow deck, you're a super slow deck, but you're ability lock and they're not, and they can never actually one-shot your Greninjas, your Greninja breaks, so that's actually really, really cool. Unfavorables, Vikabulu and Gollygarb are pretty unfavorable simply because they can apply so much pressure in the early turns. Vikabulu doesn't even need a Vikavolt setup to start putting pressure on you. They just need to find a grass energy, and they can start one-shotting your throw keys, which is really, really gross. And then Golisopod again, as long as they can find their turn 2 Golisopod, they don't even have to move it into the active. They can just poke for first impression for 30 and still start one-shotting your throw keys. So it's decks like this, it's decks that apply early pressure that Greninja will always struggle with. Unfortunately, 2 of the most aggressive decks in the format at the moment are grass types as well, so it makes it even worse for Greninja. But that being said, like I say, people will always find a way of playing Greninja, and it's definitely not dead. It's not anywhere near as dead as I thought it was going to be when it lost Dive Ball.
Yeah, it's in a precarious spot. As you said, it's lost a lot of things. I actually think now that Versus Seeker's gone, you play physically 4 more supporters than you used to. Either you go a Skylar route or you go for the Lily route, and that actually improves your early game, which is really weird. The fact that we're not that terrible in the early turns. Greninja's known for like losing on turn 1 and 2. That actually happens a lot less than it used to, so it's much more based on its matchups. I really like the Alolan Vulpix in the deck. It's something that you're already playing High Brooklet Hills, so once you've done your duplicates, you can then evolve into Greninja, free retreat into Vulpix and start beaconing. It forces Guzmas from the opponent, which can, they don't always have it, and they don't always have the board to do it on the right turn. Or it forces ends. Both are like pretty good for Greninja because it does still struggle with its draw, and if they don't end you, you can be searching out your pieces, which is really important. So Greninja can still just build this dominant board state. Ability lock is nuts. That's like, obviously we've not talked about Garbodor just yet, but a lot of people are moving towards a thicker line of Garbotoxin right now and less Trashalanche, and that's because ability lock is so ridiculous in this format, and Greninja is probably the best ability locking deck out there, which is really bizarre. So it's like the most permanent ability lock we can have. So if we think about Greninja, instead of being a deck that's really reliant on abilities, and in fact is a deck that can beat all the other ability decks, it's actually pretty appealing. So There's still going to be the headaches of prizes. There's still going to be the headaches of dead draw. But it is a ridiculously powerful ability locking deck right now. In at number 7, we have Ninetales. This is one that has really been adapting recently. There's been quite a few League Cup performances by some top players. I believe Michael Pramor, also Azul Garcia, they've both been doing well with Alolan Ninetales. And it was very surprising to me because I had not really written it off, but I hadn't seen much potential in the deck in this new format. But they've come up with a pretty cool way of adapting Alolan Ninetales to be very competitive in the format. And in fact, giving it a really nice Gardevoir matchup. And the way they do this is by having a very thick Tapu Koko count, oftentimes it's 3, and an even thicker Potown count, and having 4, and then really going heavy on the Devolve approach. And this is going to improve your matchups against Gardevoir into very favourable, I would say. The Metagross isn't even that bad of a matchup as long as you don't start evolving into your GX Pokemon and just feed them single prize Pokemon whilst going for this Devolve approach. You have a lot of turns to do flying flips as well, so evolution decks are not great against Ninetales as long as you have this Devolve package in there. Volcanion via typing is going to be nice. Even if they play things like Ho-Oh, you can still reach them with Blizzard Edge. Or you can just go for a heavy Koko Choice Band route as well. So you have options against those decks. Unfavorables, Vikabulu, they can heal off damage, so going for like Devolve obviously isn't powerful. Unless you catch them sweet with Potown in the early turns for some reason. And they can just one-hit you, so that's not the easiest of matchups. And Greninja is also difficult. The Devolve isn't a great approach unless you can do it very, very early. And Greninja typically plays a very high field blower count, so they get around Potown fairly often, especially because they will play their own stadium in a 3 or 4 count regardless. So Devolve isn't great against Frogs, even though it is like a stage 3 deck, because the 130 HP is just too much once they get into those. So not great matchups there, but those aren't the worst unfavorables to have. And when you have artillery on your side, you're pretty consistent, you're fairly end-proof. You have a lot of cool tricks up your sleeve. You can go for the Devolve line. You can have Tapu Fini as well in the deck for a really cool GX attack if anything gets too out of hand. If any deck has a very explosive start, if someone wants to key our way, you can gust that away. Or if they get an early Gardevoir GX and start ramping a bunch of energy, that could be very scary for you. And if the Devolve isn't set up, you can buy yourself some turns with Tapu Fini. And let's bear in mind as well that it has the other attack, which is a actually fairly efficient option in this deck because you have Aqua Patch to do the 120 damage anywhere on the board. If you've been doing Flying Flips or Ice Blades, that can finish games off for you without the need for Guzma. So there's a lot of intricacies with Ninetales, and just by having Octillery and Alolan Vulpix in such high counts, you have inherent consistency. So there's a lot to like about Ninetales, and it's one that I want to explore further.
Yeah, definitely. I think this is one that I personally hadn't written off, and it's one that I put a lot of testing into in the start of the format. So it's interesting to see how it's evolved as the format's sort of settled down. You pretty much said everything I was going to say, though. The kind of strategy with the deck now is Flying Flip multiple times whilst setting up Ninetales on the back against these evolution decks. Tapu Fini, anything that gets it out of hand, and then just devolve the rest to try and win that way. And then in other games, Ice Path and Blizzard Edge are just two such strong attacks that you just win games through being able to do 160 for 3 minimum. If you're able to Koko Flip before that as well, you're hitting so much for a knockout. Plus, in combination with Choice Band and stuff as well, it's just super, super strong. And it's definitely a card that I think / deck that I think still has a lot of potential. And it's now people have worked out how to beat Gardevoir, because initially Gardevoir was an incredibly difficult matchup. Now people have worked out how to beat Gardevoir. I actually think it could be a real sleeper pick for some of the upcoming regionals. Next up, we have Xerneas Break, kind of a bit of an infamous deck here on OmniPoke. It's one that Joe took to Bremen this weekend, and a friend of ours, Tamal, took to top 8. So it's definitely seen a lot of play over here in the UK. And maybe that'll transpire over to the US and some of these other regionals coming up soon. Who knows? But yeah, it's definitely another really cool non-EX deck that just loves prize trading and loves how slow the format is at the moment. Because against anything where anything that gives Xerneas Break time gives it turns to Geomancy, it's going to really struggle. Once they have the board, Xerneas Break wins games just from having a board state. So it's super, super strong. And in the fact that the format is actually so much more Stage 2 heavy than I expected to be this time last year, it's the perfect place for Xerneas right now, because it means the format does naturally give it time to Geomancy to build up this energy count, and then to live stream for a huge chunk of damage. For overall matchups wise, Ninetales, again, it's a deck that, one, gives them time, plus two, like this whole new devolve kind of style of deck doesn't really work against Xerneas because you're 130 HP minimum, and so if they're devolving, you're only minusing 20 HP. Plus, you don't need to evolve and activate their Potown until the turn you're taking 2 prizes anyway. Plus, you have Fairy Gardens to bounce their Potowns anyway. You can play around the GX attack really well because you just carry on ramping energy. It's just really, really difficult for them to be able to keep up with you, especially as they're also a Stage 1 deck, whereas we're technically a Stage 1 deck, but we're only giving up 1 prize, whereas they're giving up 2, which is really nice. And then Garbodor variants, because you can kind of limit how many items you're playing, plus you can always one-shot Garbs super easily. It means that Garb really isn't too much of a good counter against Xerneas. Also being able to, again, it's the kind of deck that is just pushing the game, like extending the game longer. Garb wants you to have a long game because you're going to be playing more cards, you're going to be playing more items, so you're going to be boosting their Trash Alliance damage. Well, you just don't have to do that because you can just Geomancy turn after turn. You need access to find a Bridget, and you need a Fairy Energy, and essentially the deck works from there. So it's not like you're going to be playing Trash Alliance at all, which is really, really nice. Unfavourables, however, I've been talking about the slow format. The first one I want to point out is Gardevoir Sylveon. Gardevoir naturally is a really, really good matchup unless they're playing Sylveon plus Parallel City, and at that point it's a really, really difficult matchup because they can, if they're able to find the combination of Parallel City plus PGX, they can wipe out like upwards of 8 energy at a time, which is just disgusting because it puts it's like Twilighting against the Garbodor. It just resets your damage and gives them so many more turns to carry on. It only takes them 1 turn to reset your damage, so they can then start carrying on, knocking out Xerneases, knocking out Lele's, knocking out Oranguru, and just taking off more and more energy each turn. As long as they can get into this combo, and pretty much all you need to do is miss a beat with N as the Xerneas Break deck, because as soon as they get a Sylveon out, they're going to be Magical Ribboning for exactly Parallel plus DCE plus something else. So as soon as you miss a beat with N, they're going to have that combo in their hand, and they're going to be able to take away, if they want to at that point, they're going to be able to take away as much energy as they want to and reset your damage completely. So that it is really, really awkward. Greninja, again, it's another deck that also really appreciates time. But unfortunately, I feel Greninja slightly prefers, like it can get into its combo a little bit quicker. And whilst you're both decks that want time, Greninja can actually deal with Xerneas's a little bit more consistently. You can actually snipe on the bench whilst dealing damage in the active, so you're able to set up turns where you can take out multiple energy plus multiple Xerneases at a time. You can also take out energy from the bench, as I say, completely, being able to like double snipe an Oranguru with 3 energy or 2 energy in the XP share on. That's actually more influential than taking out a main attacker in the deck, because that's just what the deck's damage is usually based on the bench. And Greninja doesn't mind fighting for the bench at all because they can really easily do it, especially if they, like I say, have time to get that setup, which is really, really difficult to deal with as Xerneas. It's definitely winnable, obviously, because Greninja can brick, as we've said. But it's if both players have an optimal setup, Greninja usually wins because they're also able to apply pressure to the bench, as we've said. And then Volk, turn 1 Kiawe against this deck is actually really, really gross because it's one of the only decks that can apply pressure super quickly and start knocking out Xerneases from turn 2, especially if they've gone first. It means that you're Geomancying for 2 energy, but unless you've got any XP share on the board, you're then losing 1 energy, so you're essentially only you're only net gaining 1 energy a turn, and it's just not good enough to then be able to deal with a Ho-Oh in your face, for them to then respond with another Ho-Oh or a Volk or something else. So whilst it's a deck that you usually uptrade against, Kiawe has kind of made it so that they can be fast enough to actually start outracing you from the early turns, and you can never really build double wood from there.
Yeah, Xerneas Break, it's obviously a deck that's close to me. It hates early pressure, as Jack just said. I think the hardest Garbodor variant for you would be Drampa Garb. If they do get the turn 2 KO, it gets very difficult. Volcanion, if they get turn 1 Kiawe, it's very difficult. But other than that, you have time against a lot of the format right now. You are inherently one of the most consistent decks in the format as Xerneas as well, which is a pretty big deal. A very appealing trait for this deck is that it's so simple. You just need to bridge it either on turn 1 if you're going second, or in the first 2 turns if you go first, which is really easy to achieve, especially if you go via my route where I have 4 Lele and double bridge it. You won't prize it and you'll just grab all your dudes. All you need is a fair energy from then you're spamming the board with energies, and spamming the board with energy is good against just about anything in the game because you set up your attackers for the entire game whilst at the same time setting up your damage for the whole game. So as long as you're not pressured, this deck is dangerous, and it is very consistent as well. So there's a lot of good things about the deck. I was saying actually earlier when I did my report of Bremen that I won't be playing this anymore because I feel there will be a trend towards a Sylveon build of Gardevoir, and that's kind of upsetting for me. That's definitely a matchup that you can't dodge forever as Xerneas Break because Gardevoir will remain popular. So it's in a precarious spot, is old Xerneas, and it might be one that has to go back in the binder for a bit as long as Sylveon remains popular. But who knows, if Gardevoir doesn't go towards the Sylveon route, it's still pretty much a very good contender. For tech options, I played Field Blower in Bremen. I thought it was reasonable. It's pretty good for Fury Belts on like Salazzle and Volcanion decks, and it's pretty good for freeing up Ability Lock so that you can get Oranguru draws to like close out your games, which is pretty good. So that would be one I'd look at. Another one's actually Enhanced Hammer, which I forgot to put on the slide itself, but Enhanced Hammer makes your Drampa Garb a very favourable matchup. It was a card that we used to play in Xerneas previously, and that improves the Drampa, so then literally every Garbodor variant is positive for you, which is pretty cool. It even doesn't hurt against things like Gardevoir, because they pretty much rely on double colourless energies as well to ramp into 130 in the early instances, unless they somehow go like Candy Candy, Guardy Guardy, Spring Spring attach. Like, that just doesn't happen, so they are reliant on DCE. So having Enhanced Hammers back in the list could be a way to go for Xerneas. Or another route I've heard a few people murmuring about is the Garbodor route, where you take out Fairy Gardens in place for a few Float Stones, then you play a 2-2 Garbotoxin. You can see the unfavourable matchups that are written down, they're all ability focused. So if you're going to go for the route with Garbodor instead, they can't use their abilities, and you basically slow the game down even further. And as we've said, as long as the game is slow, Xerneas is very happy to just Geomancy a bunch until it is ready to start whacking for ridiculous numbers. So Garbodor could also be a pretty cool way to play this deck and give it a real control aspect, which is a pretty interesting one in my book. Alrighty, on to number 5. It's going to be Metagross. Metagross was hyped pretty much as soon as Worlds concluded because Gardevoir won, and everyone was like, well, Metagross is pretty good now because, you know, it's just a counter to what just won Worlds, and it's no longer has to worry about Decidueye as much because Decidueye lost the Vileplume part, and that was a big worry for Metagross at the time. It's proving itself to be fairly dangerous. I know a lot of top players were playing it, notably Robin Schultz was a player using Metagross to a high finish in Bremen. There's a couple others that made Day 2 as well, so people have been succeeding with Metagross GX just because he is ridiculously high HP that some decks physically can't get around. Vikabulu is a deck that's capped and therefore can't get around Metagross, so it gets caught in the whole max potion loop. Gardevoir, although it can get into one-hit KOs, and if you actually play Parallel Plea, you have a chance against Metagross, but in general, a standard Gardevoir build should not stand up to Metagross very well at all. So as long as you are being able to tank, you are pretty much favoured in any of those matchups. So that's pretty good for you. You hit decent numbers with choice bands, or if you have Necrozma on your side as well, that can also be helpful to reach one-hit KOs each turn. It is awkward, of course, against Volcanion, thanks to your weakness to fire. Even if you do play things like Necrozma or even Mimikyu, you can make those matchups a bit closer, especially if you play Mimikyu, because then you're 2-for-1ing them, and you're protecting your Metagross on the bench, so not only do they have to respond with other attackers, they also need to be Guzmaing at the same time. And if they Guzma, you still have 2 energy on Mimikyu regardless, so you're able to copy them once again. So Volk is unfavored, but if you play Mimikyu, it's actually pretty okay in my book. And then Greninja, very, very difficult matchup because you're both evolving up, you're both giving each other time to get set up. And when Greninja gets time to set up, they're going to turn off your abilities. You can't do anything. They do pretty much everything. So Metagross has to dodge and weave and has to pick its moments to be a successful deck in the format, but in the right spots, it can still be a very aggressive and awkward deck to play around for some decks that literally just don't have answers for his high HP.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's lower than I perhaps expected it to be at the start of the format on this tier list, but it's still definitely got a lot behind it. As you heard, one of the Schultz brothers was playing it, so it's definitely a deck to consider if there's like top tier players considering the deck themselves. 250 HP, like just in general, is so huge and it's so difficult to deal with. And I get, like we say, against anything that can't really deal with that, you're going to have a real nice time because you can max potion loop things. But that being said, having a difficult Volcanion / Fire style matchup, even with Mimikyu, I think it's still difficult, and it's kind of I feel that's always going to hold me back from playing the deck personally, and maybe why some people it holds people from playing the deck as well, just because Fire is actually a really popular archetype at the moment. There was a lot more Fire this weekend than I expected, considering I think a lot of people were hyping Guardi. There was still a lot of Fire, which was really interesting to see, which perhaps pushed the Metagrosses down the tables a little bit. But that being said, the ability is like the deck in general is once it gets set up, it's kind of it doesn't really ever lose because it's just in this constant loop of being able to hit things and then not get knocked out and hit things and not get knocked out, and eventually you'll sort of attrition your opponent out and they won't be able to send anything up to survive a KO anymore. And whilst you'll be out of max potions, you'll be ahead on the prize trade, and they've still got hit 250 HP. So it's a deck that if you can get over the fact it's a stage 2 and sometimes has consistency issues, I think it's definitely one to consider still. And having a free Guardi, if they're not playing Sylveon again, is just another really, really nice thing to have. Next up, we have Vikabulu, another stage 2 deck that has definitely been talked about quite a bit. I think a lot of people thought this deck was actually going to be one of the best going into post-rotation. And it's definitely proving itself. A lot of people were playing it this weekend. One made top 8 as well. So definitely a deck to consider still. It's another deck that once it gets the setup, it just kind of does what it does. It doesn't need to draw cards. It doesn't need to draw the stupidly good combos each turn to try and carry on competing. It just needs to announce strong charge and then Nature's Judgment. And as long as they can find one energy a turn, they can pretty much do what they want, which is really, really difficult to deal with, considering, like we say, ability lock is in and around the format, but against anything that isn't ability locking you, you are going to have a relatively fun time as long as you're able to dodge the fact that you're playing a stage 2 deck. Favorable matchups wise, as I mentioned when talking about Greninja, the fact that Bulu can one-shot Froakies from turn 1 with Horn Attack is really, really interesting, and it means that the matchup is pretty favorable. As long as they don't, from my testing, what I've found, as long as the Bulu finds the Grass Energy turn 1, they win. It can be difficult if they don't find the Grass Energy turn 1 because it means that first Froakie turns into a Frogadier and they're always one prize behind than they would have been, which means that they're always one Greninja behind than they would have been, and that sometimes can be an issue. But if they're able to find that Grass Energy, which isn't difficult because against that kind of deck you don't necessarily have to bridge it turn 1 because they're naturally so slow anyway. You don't always have to bridge it turn 1. You can actually just set up and dig for this Grass Energy. It can actually mean that you win the game in a different way rather than just getting a good board setup, but actually applying early pressure is really, really nice. Ninetales is another deck that I think is pretty favorable. The fact that you can one-shot with Nature's Judgment now that most lists are running Choice Band over Fury Belt means that you're able to easily play around their GX attack. You never have to play into their GX attack at all. And the fact that you can, it's really difficult for them to then KO Vikavolt because if you can set up 2 Vikavolts as the Vikabulu player, they have to waste turns knocking out the Vikavolt, discarding their own energy, for you to then still be taking 2 prizes on them. So it's actually really, really difficult for them to play around Bulu as well, because it's all dependent on the Bulu player's turn. It's not like they can sort of prevent you doing 2-10. As long as Bulu is able to find the choice band, it's actually a really, really favourable matchup. Unfavourable matchups, Metagross, as we mentioned, because you're kind of capped at 2-10, Metagross just always is able to use this max potion retreating loop to heal off the damage and still one-shot Bulus. Because they can run choice band of their own, they can do 180 with Giga Hammer, which means it's pretty much the perfect counter to Bulu, because the Bulu player is capped, whereas the Metagross player is capped at exactly the damage that their main attacker is running, provided the Bulu player, as I say, isn't playing Fury Belts, which most Bulus aren't playing at the moment. Choice Band seems to be the better variant, just because you're actually able to trade into things like Gardevoir much easier. You only need 1 Coco spread, whereas with a Fury Belt you need 2. And even that difference can be really, really big, because a lot of Gardevoir players are able to respond on a Coco relatively quickly. So I think Choice Band is definitely the optimal play at the moment, but it does mean that Metagross needs less to be able to just carry on dealing with you. But I don't think really you should be playing around Metagross. I think it's much better to play around Guardi anyway. And then Xerneas Break, again, they can Tapu Wilderness to be able to just one-shot without discards. They can also discard to knock you out anyway. Plus, if they can get a couple of turns of Coco spreads, which again, Xerneas is a deck which doesn't apply early pressure, so it's likely that they will get a couple of turns of Coco spreads. Nature's Judgment without the discard still one-shots the breaks. So yeah, it's really, really interesting. And it means that provided, if both decks set up optimally, the Vikabulu player should have a couple of turns of Coco spreading, meaning that Xerneas are just knocked out really easily. So it's another pretty unfavourable matchup. Tech-wise, we've got a lot of techs for this one, just because there's a lot of one-obs you can play that actually swing different matchups. Turtonator is one that actually helps with Metagross, which is really nice. Plus, it can also do a chunk against a Galissapod, which is really, really nice. Vikavolt GX is one that I think I've seen a couple of people play. I saw a couple of people play at the League Cup on the second day. The GX attack doing 60 to everything. If you're able to find space for a Devolution Espeon as well, it can actually just win you Stage 2 matchups that you normally wouldn't be able to win. Guardi is naturally quite a hard matchup, because you do need to Coco before you start taking knockouts, and obviously Metagross you can't ever reach. But if you're able to do 60 to everything with the Vikavolt, if they've rare candied up, you can just evolve them all and take multiple prizes and force them to never really get a Metagross out again, which is really, really nice. Plus, just dealing 60 means that Metagross is then in range again, which means that they have to waste max potions on 60 damage rather than 210 damage. And that's the kind of attrition war you want to be having against Metagross. You want to waste their resources on little pokes of damage to be able to then Nature's Judgment later and force them to have 210 damage on the bench, so you can just be able to gut them out later on and knock out, sort of take 2 easy prizes. Coco GX is another one really good for the Guardi matchup. A lot of Guardi players don't play around Coco GX at all, especially in Game 1 of a best-of-3 series. I have fallen victim to it, and it's like, it will just come out of nowhere. I think the more people play Coco, the more Guardi players will play around it. It caught me once in one game this weekend, and I was playing around it for the rest of the game. So I feel like it's a tech that you have to put in to do well at one tournament and then take out again. It's not a tech that you can just throw in to beat the Guardi matchup. But that being said, it will steal games. And then finally Mew, there was a really interesting list that ran 2 Mew that we saw over the weekend as well, that I think is another way of trying to swing the prize trade, and being able to do 210 damage with a 50 HP Mew is just entertaining as well. So being able to swing the prize trade and not have to force your opponent, to find a Guzma as well as take the knockout, rather than just be able to leave your Bulu active sort of in the open, is really, really interesting to doing that prize trade swing. Obviously, Mew has super low HP, so it's really easy to deal with, but it is only worth 1 prize, so you kind of have that trade-off. And even just a 1 count, even having another free retreater is just a really, really nice option in the deck.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Mew. It was Patrick who made top 8 with the Vikabulu list, and he was playing 2 Mew in there. It's almost like half a Alolan Vulpix, which was really cool. When I was actually testing Pikachu Magnezone, I loved having Mew in there just because you could scout and find yourself a Vikavolt on turn 2. If you have the candy in there, or if you don't, you can find yourself, a Bulu, another attacker, even a Lele to make sure that you can keep drawing and be consistent. So the Mew is like a consistency card that doubles up as an attacker at the same time. And as you said, Jack, it's even a free retreater, so there's no downside to having Mew in your deck, and it makes you a bit more glass cannony, I guess. But when you have the natural bulk of Bulu that you could use, it means that you have the bulky approach if you're up against something that can't take one-shots, or if you are up against a deck that can easily deal with Bulu, you can go a non-EX route with Mew, and Vikavolt itself can be an attacker as well if you set up multiple. So it's still versatile, and some of these tech options, obviously you're not going to put all of these in. You pick your moments for what you expect in the meta, but Vikavolt Bulu is still a deck that I'm a fan of, and I feel can continue to produce good results in this format. In at number 3, we have Volcanion. We've sort of packaged them together alongside Salazzle Ho-Oh. I know they interact very differently. Their matchups aren't all that too different on paper, though, so we thought we'd keep them all in one nice, neat bundle. All the fire decks, obviously, of course, love playing against Metagross. Thanks to type coverage, you can just deal with them very swiftly. They're basically left trying to use things like Necrozma, Lele, Mimikyu if they play it, but they're really scrabbling for stuff to do. And especially if you play Salazzle, you should be fine. And Baby Volk is really good at taking the early prizes against Metagross as well. So I still think you're favoured, even if they do everything they can to not provide you like free prizes. And also Glisspod Garbodor. In a similar vein, they're going to go for a Lele plus Garbodor plus Coco approach. So you're not often taking the nice freebie prizes, but at the same time, you're the deck hitting one-shots with things like Ho-Oh and Turtonator, and they're trying to two-shot and keep up with things like Lele, which are suboptimal in their matchup, really. So those are favourable, and unfavourables, Espeon Garbodor, naturally because you have to attach so many energies to all of your dudes, is very awkward. You're left trying to use Turtonator GX, basically, and if they do establish Garbotoxin, you're not actually reaching one-hit KOs, which is pretty awkward. And Gardevoir is also awkward for the similar reason that they love whenever an opponent's Pokemon has lots of energy on them, because it means they have to extend a lot less to reach one-hit knockouts. So there are awkward matchups for Volk. It was a deck that was very, very popular in Bremen, and the reason for that is it's just simple and consistent. It's, again, one of the most consistent performers we've had. It's very non-EX focused. You have things like Brooklet Hill, which can get you things like Starmie or Octillery, the card that I'm actually most preferable towards. It can get you into those combo cards very quickly. Gets you your Volky X's as well to get early steam up pressure from non-EX Volcanion. So it's just simple and effective, really. They can ramp to high numbers with steam up still, and they just have so many energy accelerating options right now with Max Elixir, Kiawe, and non-EX Volcanion with the reload of Nitro Tank mid-game as well. You're always going to have attackers set up, and it's essentially down to you racing with this deck, as it always has been the case. If you're playing Ho-Oh Salazzle, I've tested it quite a bit, actually, and I really am starting to fall for Salazzle. I think it's a really incredible card, so that's one I want to play more in future. So overall, I think Octillery is definitely the way I try and play Volk now. I'm much happier having energy retrievals in the list, because Octillery is so good at end-proofing you. And when you're a deck that wants to race for prizes, N is so grim. And now that we don't have Versaseeker in the format, you lose to N a much higher percentage of the time than you used to, because you had, 3 or 4 more outs in your deck via Versaseeker being draws. Now you trade that off for having Octillery, so you can actually draw into things like Guzma Energy for game, for example. So that would be the way I'd want to play Volcanion. I still think it's a powerful performer, even if it doesn't have the best Gardevoir matchup. Because it's just inherently consistent and can ramp into ridiculous numbers still.
Yeah, definitely. And a good, even though we've said unfavorable matchups of Gardevoir, a good Volk player can still beat Gardevoir. Turtonator is the key to the matchup, I feel. Provided they get early pressure with Baby Volks, Turtonator is actually a really, really difficult card to deal with for Gardevoir. The fact that they discard their own energy, plus they have 190, which is a really awkward number. Plus they can run Fury Belts as well. Turtonator is definitely the key to that matchup. So yeah, Volk's definitely still standing strong in the format. I think it's only going to get stronger. I actually think Regular Volk will start seeing a bit more of a comeback over Ho-Oh Salazzle, but I think they're both pretty even in their meta share at the moment anyway, and I'm also kind of a sucker for Salazzle. It wasn't until testing it against Joe that I saw how powerful this card could be, and it is nuts being able to do so much just for 2 energy. Even Queen's Haze is just so annoying. Like against Gardevoir, just discarding all of their energy and then only leaving yourself on 2 means that they can very rarely ramp into a knockout for the next turn. So it's just really, really a really, really versatile card, and definitely one that I think we'll see more and more play. On to number 2 is Garbodor variants. Again, we've kind of lumped this all together because Garbodor is at the heart of all of these. As we mentioned earlier on, Garbotoxin is becoming more of the focus. A lot of people are playing a 3-2-1 line in favor of the Garbotoxin now, just because there's so many abilities out and about. With the past 2 decks, 2 or 3 decks have been ability reliant, and as you can see, we haven't talked about Gardevoir yet, so spoiler alert. The best deck, or in our opinion, the best deck in the format is also ability based. So Garbotoxin is definitely at a premium right now, but that's not to sleep on Trash Launch at all. People will still play items, especially in a Stage 2 style format where people are rare candying, people are ultra balling for Lele for Bridget. People will naturally play a lot of items, and in the late game, you will be able to kill a Lele. You'll be able to even ramp into doing enough damage to knock out Gardevoirs as well with Choice Band and stuff. So, it's definitely not a tall attack to sleep on, but I think Garbotoxin is where Garbodor shines at the moment, against things like Gardevoir, Volcanion, Metagross. All of these ability-reliant decks are just shut down completely. It forces them to have Field Blower to even get going. So yeah, it's really, really good right now. Onto the variants. Espeon, I think, is one of the more interesting ones, and it's personally my favorite. Favorable matchups in Decidueye and Volk. They both have to attach a lot of energy to be able to start dealing damage to you. Psychic can actually one-shot a Volk that doesn't have a Fury Belt on, provided you have a Choice Band on yourself, which is really, really nice. And it means that it's quite difficult for them to respond as well because, again, you're 10 HP out of their natural just steam up range. So they have to find either an extra steam up or a tool to be able to respond on you, which is really nice. Plus, you can start side-beaming them as well, and no one really wants to flip coins. The deck naturally runs quite a lot of switching cards anyway, but just being able to poke things with side-beam is really, really nice. And again, Decidueye. Divide GX is really, really good against these Stage 2 decks. Just being able to deal with that first routes or Curlier or Beldum, or in this case Rowlet or Dartrix, is going to mean that you actually start prize trading a little bit quicker. And again, Psybeam is just another really, really annoying thing for them to have to deal with, especially if they want to start applying this pressure. Even on things like Coco, just Psybeaming a Coco, it doesn't really progress the board state, but it means that they're not flying flipping you. Again, you don't want to start receiving 2 or 3 flying flips because, again, as we mentioned when talking about Decidueye, all they need to find at that point is Espeon plus energy. So, again, it's really, really nice to be able to have all of these options. Unfortunately, Golisopod Garb is a difficult matchup. You have to run things like Acerola to be able to deal with the pressure from Golisopod turn 1. Being able to do 120 with first impression from turn 2 is really, really difficult to deal with, especially given that sometimes you won't be able to find your Espeon. So that'll be an Eevee going down super quickly, or that'll be a Trubbish going down super quickly. So yeah, it's definitely a difficult Pokemon to deal with, especially as, again, they also only have 1 energy on them at a time. So Psychic's only doing 90 or 120. And Golisopod is not a card you want to leave with damage on it because it's just going to get Acerolled and you're just going to take another 120 from the opponent. So yeah, Goligab is definitely a difficult matchup to deal with. Speaking of the deck, favourable matchups in Gardevoir and Greninja. Again, Gardevoir kind of similar to Psychic because Golisopod has so little energy on it. The Gardevoir player finds it so difficult to actually one-shot Galisopods. I know this from personal experience this weekend. Golisopod was without a doubt my least favourite matchup to play. I even played a Solgaleo and I enjoyed it more than playing against Galisopods this weekend. So yeah, it's just not a nice card to have to deal with, especially when they can also at some point cross and cut GX you and hide on the bench. So even when they have started to stack energy on them, they could just hide on the bench. They still force a Guzma. So yeah, it's really, really difficult to deal with. And again, as I mentioned when talking about Greninja, first impression, knocks out a Froakie without even having to move into the active. So you can start applying pressure early, and later on in the game you can start moving around and start getting that 120, meaning that you're going to be one-shotting their breaks super easily anyway. Unfavourables, Volk, of course, because you're weak to Volk, does mean that Golisopod does take a huge chunk from Volk. It is pretty much always going to be one-shotting you, which is the kind of thing that Golisopod doesn't want. Golisopod loves just taking a hit, because you can then Ace a Roller out of there and heal off that damage, and then be able to do first impression again, which is really, really nice. In a similar vein, Vikabulu is a difficult matchup because they can ramp into 210 with Choice Band, meaning that it's super difficult for you to be able to start bouncing your Galisopods and knocking or price trading favorably, because you're getting one shot, whereas they're not really only ever taking 120. You actively have to use your GX to one shot, which is really, really annoying. Unfortunately, you can armor press out of their range, but if they've got a flying flip from Coco early on in the game, it armor presses as irrelevant, because you're only doing 100 to them, so you're not knocking them out, and you're still going to be taking enough to be knocked out by the attack with Choice Band. So yeah, this is personally my least favorite build of Garbodor, because I also think it's super inconsistent. But that being said, Martlet's just won with the deck, so it's just a personal preference thing. I think the deck is insanely powerful, it's just not to my playstyle. Finally, Drampa. This is the one that we have the least text on, simply because it feels like a super 50-50 deck right now. Favourite matchups, Decidueye. Decidueye now runs a lot more special energy. They're running 4 Rainbow pretty much all the time over Grass Energy, especially personally from the ones I've seen anyway. So being able to Righteous Edge is super nice. And again, being able to get an early Berserk to start dealing with some of the little dudes is just going to be annoying for them. It's another deck that just really appreciates time, and Drampa's definitely a card that can actually start applying pressure. It's a bit more awkward to start applying pressure than Golisopod, simply because you do need more of a setup. You do need DC plus energy, plus a way of damaging the bench. But Drampa will find ways of doing it, so it's definitely not one to sleep on. Unfavourable-wise, Ho-Oh Salazzle, again, being able to, if your opponent gets a turn 1 Kiawe, they can start turn 2 knocking out Drampas, and you're just never able to reach that 190. Like I say, that 10 HP is so influential. Like, you wouldn't think just 10 HP would make that much of a difference, but because it pushes them out of range, you can never one-shot with Berserk without a flying flip, and if you're flying flipping, you're probably losing another prize to a Kiawe'd Ho-Oh, so it's just never really in your favor. So yeah, it's super awkward for the Drampa deck to be able to deal with Ho-Oh Salazzle, especially even if they don't get Kiawe turn 1, but if they do, it's a super lost cause in my opinion.
Man, good job, Jack. That was a lot of talking. I'll just do a quick rundown of what I feel about the decks. Jack's gone through all the matchups and he's went spot on all of those. In Bremen, Glisspot was the most popular Garbodor variant by far. It ended up winning the event, but also plenty of people folded with the deck. And I think from my own testing, it is less consistent than it used to be. When we saw it at Worlds, obviously achieved the win as well. It seems like a kind of high roller deck. When it starts working, it's incredibly difficult to beat. But at the same time, you have to be very careful with your draws, and you also need to be fairly fortunate. I think both Espeon and Drampa are more middle ground in terms of they have less outright favourables and less outright unfavourables. They're much more split 50-50, so you'll have to work harder for all of your wins, but they feel safer. They both feel more consistent because Espeon you can naturally find that via your own attachments onto Eevee, so you can get into your attackers much more consistently. Drampa as well, you have Big Wheel to fall back on. You then can start using Haller, which we saw in the top 4 and second place list. Both actually played Haller in addition to 4 Sycamore and 4 N, so you get to actually benefit from having more useful supporters than any other deck, basically, because Drampa's one of the only cards that can really benefit from Haller, because you can Big Wheel. You know, if you go second, you can do it on the first turn and get into your combo, which is pretty crazy. So I really like Espeon and Drampa. Obviously Espeon, it's like cursed for me after doing badly at Worlds with it, but it's starting to get back on my good side, because I think it has a lot of potential in this format. I think overall every Garbodor variant is just super strong with Garbotoxin. everyone's so reliant on Tapu Lele. N is just so insane. Like, every deck in the moment, it feels like whenever you play a game at the moment, N is a huge deciding factor in the game. And now that we no longer have Versus Seeker, Ns are much more powerful than they used to be. And now having Garbotoxin in addition to the N means that Ultra Balls are no longer outs and Lelos are no longer outs to get people back on track. Either people need Guzma for game, or either people need more draw supporters for game, like Sycamores and such. So Garbotoxin is just such on a crazy high power level right now that it just lifts all these archetypes so much because you just have so much more control. It's almost like you're playing Vileplume item lock. It's like when you're playing Decidueye Plume and you end someone down to 1 or 2. They have so few outs to win the game. And now that Versus Seeker's gone, Garbotoxin fulfills the same role, it seems, a lot of the time. So these are the most control-y decks that we have right now. So take your pick, really, based on how consistent you want to be, what matchups you want to be favourable, and how many 50-50s you want to take, and how many grindy wins you're going to have to make. In terms of tech options, Espeon EX definitely goes into Espeon GX lists and has been creeping into Drampa GX lists as well because of the high Potown count that they play in addition to Tapu Koko promo. It's already been staple in Gliscopod, but I would also start highly considering putting them into the other two as well. Tapu Fini GX, it was played by Mark Lutz in the Gliscopod build because you're already playing Rainbows. Drampa can choose to play Rainbows even with Potown. And you can also cash in on Tapu Fini's GX attack against things like specifically Ho-Oh-Salazzle. After they use a Kiawe, you can just bridge it, get yourself Fini, and pick it all back up, which is pretty crazy. You can also benefit from its attack with Choice Band. You can hit hundreds on Volcanions and other things weak to water, I guess. But that's not really a huge factor. You can at least force yourself out of the active if you happen to start with it. So it's never too much of a downside to have it on your board. And Plumeria is an interesting card. We saw a few Worlds players using it. I think it was definitely Frank Diaz who was running a couple of them. And some Energy Denial right now isn't too shabby either. When you're pairing it with Garbotoxin, it's effective against even things like Guardy. It's really good against things like Gliscopod because we've already said they're very combo-based. They'd much prefer to be spamming Acerola and Guzma. Well, if you start getting rid of their energy, now they have to draw cards instead. And if they're playing draw cards, they're vulnerable because the 2-shots actually work against them. So Plumeria could also be a card that comes in for things like mirror matches, and in general adds to the whole control aspect of the Garbodor variants. On to the number one, and still no surprises here, it's going to be Gardevoir GX. It's really interesting because a lot of the decks that I saw this weekend were targeting Guardy as the number one, and it feels like that's going to just only continue. Even though it was targeted, it was still the deck that made the most spots in top 32. I think only one made top 8 in Bremen with Philip Emmerich. But it still has proved itself to be the most consistent performer at getting into top 32, getting you into the money, getting you into the points, and giving you a shot at winning the whole thing. So Gardevoir is still just inherently very strong. It's got a great draw engine with either Gallade Octillery, or Oranguru Gallade, or Sylveon using Ribbon. All of these options give you good control over your top decks and your draws in general, which lets you build up into the big 230 HP attacker, which is of course still incredible. Twilight GX being able to get back resources, getting back field blowers against the Garbodors, getting back double colorless energies, getting back supporters, all of these things are very good for you. Secret Spring, helping you ramp into Infinite Force for ridiculous numbers, is still obviously great. So even though there's a lot of awkward decks out there right now, some people are playing Metagross just to beat Guardy. Greninja also is being talked about. Rainbow Force popped up once again, mainly because you can get to play Bishop in the deck to have a good Gardevoir. All these decks are trying to look to beat Guardy, and a lot of other decks are starting to play things like Tapu Fini and Potown and Espeon. All these things are annoying for Gardevoir, but even still, it's found a way to be successful, and very successful at that. I think, based on what we've seen this weekend, Sylveon GX is a great way to go. Jack will tell you more about that in a moment, I imagine, because he has the most experience with Guardy out of the two of us. So that's something to look into for the future. I think, naturally, you have only a couple of favourables, but they're still very valid. Volcanion still came out in force just because people were expecting Gliscod and Metagross. Those two decks remain popular, so Volk will remain up there, as well as just the fact that it's very consistent and simple to play. Having a good matchup there is always going to be great, and you have a phenomenal Xerneas Break as long as you are going down the Sylveon route. So Gardevoir can pick up that little nice rogue matchup as well as an easy win. And in general, even though decks are playing these techs, they're still techs. They're still like beatable. A lot of decks are going for heavy Potown. So I think maybe going up to third Field Blower, that was something Jack has said personally he's been yearning for in his deck.
Yeah.
Some of these small adjustments to Gardevoir could be all it needs to push it back into favourable, even when decks are attacking against it.
It's weird. I played Guardi this weekend, and I didn't do very well at all. But I'm so certain this is the best deck in format. All of my ties and losses, I felt so ahead with, and it was just kind of them being slightly more ahead because I'd missed a turn or that kind of thing. So it feels like it only lost to the fact that it's a stage 2 deck. The power level of Infinite Force is insane. It's so good. I also played it with Sylveon this weekend and Parallel City, and being able to parallel play people, again, it's another thing that just wins games. So I'm so certain this is the best deck in format, as long as you can deal with the fact that it's a stage 2 deck. Which personally for me, it didn't, like the losses and ties due to them being a stage 2 deck and that kind of thing, it didn't bother me too much because I enjoy playing stage 2 decks. So it's like it's kind of a win-win for me. But yeah, I think the deck is insanely good against like a good majority of the format right now, and even with parallel play you can actually really improve some of your matchups, which is really good. So yeah, I think definitely Guardi is one that I'm going to be putting a lot more time into. We've got I don't think the format's going to change too much up until London, so I'm just going to be grinding out Guardi for now, and I think it's a super strong deck. And you've just got to get over the fact that it's a stage 2, and if you can do that, I think there's definitely the real strong power level. I'm going to be I'm going to be putting my list on Facebook that I ran with Sylveon this weekend because a couple of people have been asking for it, so that's going to be going up hopefully tomorrow as of recording this. It's a deck I definitely recommend you check out. I don't think there were a lot more people playing Sylveon this weekend than I expected. I talked to CCG member Benjamin Pham about Sylveon, and we kind of thought it would just be us playing Sylveon. Turns out there was more Sylveons than Octilleries, which was really interesting to see that I guess all Guardi players had that similar mindset. But that further justifies to me that Sylveon is the way to play the deck. It just gives you so much more versatility, even in, like, because there's so many times where Twilight is useful, but you kind of do it because you're not getting a knockout, so you're like, oh, well, Twilight. Whereas if you're Sylveon, you can play GX in the early game to slow them down, and you can build a board that will get the knockout on that turn instead. So it's not like you're wasting your GX attack and not getting value out of Twilight, because there's certain matchups where you always Twilight against Garbodor, for example, but there's certain matchups where Twilight was just kind of that, oh, I'm not getting a knockout, so I may as well Twilight so I get the knockout next time. Well, now you can play instead, and that can win games as well. So yeah, it's definitely a deck I really recommend, and I think, to me, it's definitely justified best deck in format, even though it didn't win this weekend. The fact that one made top 8, I think, means that it definitely has the legs to do so. And the fact that Galiscod Garb, I think, is one of my least favourite matchups. It's not on the unfavourite matchups here, but I think it is one of the most difficult matchups anyway. Means that I don't necessarily think it needed to win this weekend, in my mind, for it to be in the number 1 position. So maybe I'm biased, but hey. If you're not looking at playing any of these top 10 or top 13 decks, how you look at it, we have, of course, given you some rogue options as well. We've got a few of these here. Pikazone is one that Joe talked about a few days ago. He did a video on it after a League Cup in America. There was, I think it was Andrew Mahone, playing Pikazone. I don't think I saw one all weekend, which was interesting. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not a powerful deck. So definitely, yeah, I think Pikazone is one of the more interesting ones on the page. I played against a Solgaleo this weekend, and it's made me want to try Solgaleo again. I didn't need much persuasion. As I've just said, I love Stage 2 decks. But Solgaleo, again, is another inherently super strong GX in the format right now. Soul Burst, I still debate, is one of the best GX attacks in the game. It just needs to be, like, someone needs to find a way of breaking it. And I think it could be there. The fact that you have really good matchups against Gardy and even Metagross is super good, because it means that you're winning the stage 2 war. So as long as you can find a way of overcoming like things that deal early pressure to you, which could be more difficult, as long as you find a way of being able to do that, I actually think the deck could have some legs. And Ultra Road again is just a super strong ability, especially when we've got Guzma in format right now. It means Guzma Stall is not a thing for you at all, which I think is actually really relevant. Espeon Weavile is another deck that I played against this weekend, and Rule of Evil is not at all a attack to underestimate. It's really difficult to play around this, considering you really need to get it off once. It takes 3 turns essentially for a Weavile deck to win, provided the Guardy player or the Metagross player or any of these ability lock based decks, or ability based decks that are stage 2s, provided they bench a couple of things, get a couple of Guardies out, have their natural progression of the board setup that they want. It's actually really simple for the Weavile player to win. They Rule of Evil, they Tapu Koko at least once in the game, and they Miraculous Shine, and that's all it is. And that's how they win the game. It can be played around, and that's why it is outside the top 10. Plus, there are decks that the deck just kind of folds to. But that being said, if you want a free Guardy and a free Metagross, that kind of thing, this is the deck to play, because as long as the Guardy player doesn't completely play around it, which they can do, but it's kind of awkward for them to do. It's gonna get you some free wins, especially in smaller tournaments where I feel the meta will be more inherently based down these best deck in format style decks rather than decks that counter other decks. I feel like regionals, we see more decks that try and counter the meta, whereas League Cups, I feel we see more decks that are just good to try and win the League Cup. So this could be your counter deck for League Cups. Zoroark Bisharp is another deck that Joe tried last week on. It was either last week or the week before on stream. And I feel it's super close to being good. I think as soon as Zoroark GX hits the field, it's actually really interesting, and that card could even push it back into the top 10. I don't actually know the full release date of Zoroark GX. I don't know whether it's with the full release of Shining Legends or with the full release of Crimson Invasion. But we could only be 2 weeks away from this deck actually seeing more play in the top 10. Zoroark GX is a super strong card. Being able to exchange, discarding a card and drawing 2. It's the diving draw from Empoleon, but it's on stage 1, and you're running Zoroark anyway. Having Bisharp means that you're able to one-shot Guardies, so that matchup's completely fine. And then just having Zoroark to be able to deal with the fact that everyone is Lele Bridgeting right now. So being able to counter that with a Mind Jack is super strong. And again, it means that with stand-in, Guzma Stall isn't a thing against you, which is another thing that is definitely relevant in the format right now. And then finally, we've got Aquabox. Again, it's a deck that kind of has dropped off the scene, and the fact that it's weak to grass is really gross. But that being said, Lapras is still a good card. Ice Beam has inherently lost a lot of its value because of Guzma and Acerola being released. But the fact that we have Aqua Patch plus Max Elixir means that you can apply some really inherently strong pressure in the early game. And we've said throughout the course of the video, there's a couple of decks that don't like early pressure at all. And this is the kind of deck that actually can ramp into early pressure relatively easily. Plus Collect can get you out of sticky spots in the early turns as well. So again, it's another one to consider if you want to float outside of the top 10 rather than playing one of these meta decks for upcoming League Cups, League Challenges, Regionals, that kind of thing.
Yeah, some really interesting cards. I think Zoroark's one I want to test more out of this page. Weavile's something I really want to get working, but I'm still baffled as how to not lose to the matchups where Rule of Evil's just dead. You end up having dead cards in the deck. That's the biggest thing holding it back right now. But as more and more evolution decks get played, it just only ever increases in value. And not even just evolution decks, just things like Volcanion, just 3 Rules of Evil and you deal with a bunch of them all at once. And the more people are reliant on Lele, it just gets so much better for Weavile. So, yeah, Weavile's something I want to figure out. I haven't figured out how to do it yet. Zoroark's another one I want to try out more. Its break evolution is still crazy good against Ninetales, Vikabulu, a bunch of stuff like that. Bisharp is nuts again for Ninetales and Guardy. So has a bunch of good matchups. My Jack's still really good, as you said, just with Bridget. So there's something to this deck for sure. And as you said, as soon as Shining Legends comes out, its stock raises again and becomes a much more viable archetype because it's doing the same thing but with a much cleaner draw engine now with diving draw. So yeah, some good stuff there. And if you want to go for some stage 2 nonsense, go for Pikazone or Zolgaleo. I personally don't have them anywhere near the top 10, to be honest, but some people like playing with them because they're just kind of wacky and big old cannon type decks that hits silly numbers. So those are all cool as well. There we go, guys. That is going to be our top 10. Kind of a bit of cheating involved. It was like a top 13 or so decks and then some rogues in there. But it took us a while, this video, just over an hour it looks like. And that's just going to be covering everything that we've seen in the first regionals for us and how it's going to look going forward as the metagame progresses. Overall, I'm really happy with this format. I feel like you can pretty much win with any deck in the top 10, which is really cool. And it rewards good building so far and good play as well in-game because everyone is consistent with Lele, everyone's consistent with Bridget, everyone gets their deck going in general. So from the whole weekend, I saw a lot of games, or very few games, that just sort of ended because no one had anything. Typically, everyone's getting set up, everyone's having fun, everyone's trying to get their own approach going, and it's down to the players themselves trying to outplay each other. And the game's not been like that to this extent as much as it is right now. And that's really, really good to go forward in the game. So I'm really happy with the format, happy with the top 10, and it's going to be interesting to see how the format progresses in the future.
Yeah, definitely. I'm really happy with the formats right now. And I feel the top 8 of this weekend was also kind of, even though there were 4 Garb decks in the top 4, the top 8 in general was still relatively diverse, and even there was even differences between the top 8 decks. Like the top 4 decks that were Garb, there were 2 Drampas and 2 Gallipods, and even within the 2 Drampas and the 2 Gallipods, there were differences. So we're always going to be like, it feels like a really rewarding format to be playing in right now. So yeah, definitely happy with it. But other than that, thank you very much for watching. We're off to stream now, so make sure if you're not used to our usual streaming schedule, come over to twitch.tv every Wednesday to check us out streaming. We're currently looking at Expanded as well. Other than that, thank you very much for watching. I've been Jack with Joe from OmniPoke, and look forward to seeing you guys in a future video.